All right, well, welcome to Questioning Christianity. My name's Dan Patterson, and this channel's all about helping you connect the Christian story to life's deepest questions. My guest for today's episode is Greg Koukl. Greg is the founder and the president of a ministry in the US called Stand to Reason. They have a number of speakers and authors who help develop content online and in person for them. Greg's books have been profoundly helpful over the years in training an entire generation of Christians to be able to have better conversations about their faith in Jesus, about God, and about the way that the world points ultimately to Him. Certainly, his book Tactics would be a well-known fixture in many Christian libraries, but really lays out a groundwork for having just better conversations across faith and belief in general. So whether you're a Christian or a newcomer or a doubter or a skeptic, I hope this conversation will be tremendously helpful for you. So with no further ado, it's my honor to invite Greg onto the channel. Hey, Greg.
Hey, Dan, it's a pleasure to talk with you. Down under, as it were. One of us is upside down. I'm not sure which one, but uh,
I
hopefully
don't think
our
that'll
idea.
take long. You'll be able to tell it's my thinking and my way of
No, I was
inhabiting the
going to
world
say,
that's upside down.
hopefully our ideas are not. And
Yeah,
one of the things we want to do is talk about upside down ideas and how to get them straightened out. So thank you for
exactly.
having me on board.
Well, I'm really honored that you're on. We had a conversation a few times last year when I was over in the USA, just shared a conference together and just
Yeah,
really appreciated both the influence you had through your books many, many years ago on my own life and just way of being able to have healthy conversations with people
yeah,
who disagree and walk away better friends because of it. But also then just the wisdom of the character and concern and advocacy that you have for the
yeah.
gospel. And so really, really
Well,
glad you
thank
could be
you.
here.
I especially like your comment about the friendliness and geniality of conversations. Generally, when you have opposing ideas of the magnitude that we talk about, um, it's not friendly. It can be really harsh, and of course, that's not good for either side because
Mm,
we have things to learn as Christians, just as those who don't share our convictions have. And if we are not willing to listen and weigh and be genial about it, then we both lose. So
mm.
I'm glad you emphasize that because that's really important to me.
Oh, well, maybe it's a great place to start there. I mean, we're recording this right now in a point in time where rhetorical temperatures have been pretty high. I mean, at
Y-
the time of this recording, it's only a few days after the attempted assassination of presidential candidate in the US, Donald
Right,
Trump. And
right.
I think the media globally have been looking back and saying, well, what are the ways in which our conversation, our demonization of people on the other side may have contributed to the rhetorical tension, polarization of our culture, and
Right.
raising maybe some of these key concerns. And that dynamic isn't just unique to politics. You know, when you look at the writing of Jonathan Haidt and his how we form our beliefs around morality, politics, and some of the key beliefs about
Right.
religion, this temperature can definitely go up even in religious conversations. And I've
That's right.
certainly seen conversations that have produced more heat than light. I'm curious to hear from your side. What is it that you think Christianity offers as resources to help bring those temperatures down a little bit? What are some of the things built into the Christian story that maybe give us a better model for how to go into
Well,
these conversations?
it's interesting when you read the uh, the the accounts of in the Book of Acts. So that's a primary source document of the expansion of the early church, and you see how the people who Jesus trained himself engage the culture with the truth
Mm,
claims. And there were a couple things that were characteristic of them. One of them is they had tremendous boldness. They had tremendous courage because in their case, they were facing the fate that Jesus faced
mm,
from the powers that be, as it were, when he, to use a maybe an overused term, spoke truth to power.
mm,
And so they had tremendous courage because they knew what was at stake, that their ideas weren't merely kind of policy concerns that allowed them to get their way in the culture, but it had eternal ramifications for the people with whom they spoke. So
mm.
there was, in a certain sense, nothing for them to gain to persuade people about their view because, again, like it's not a policy concern they'll benefit from. It was all on behalf of the other person. So they were willing to take a risk. But when
Mm,
you see the tone of their conversations, it was they didn't use loaded rhetoric. They they talked about what they understood the facts to be pertaining to the issue, of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and then they offered cogent arguments. Now, it may be that people don't always agree with the arguments, but what's interesting is that they offered them.
Mm,
They didn't change the subject. They didn't fall into, mindless name calling and that sort of thing. And instead, they, in many cases, they actually blessed their persecutors. I'm thinking of the execution of Stephen there in the book of
mm,
Acts. How he was quite strong and straightforward with his message. Yet at the same time, when he was being executed, he was calling out for mercy upon to God for mercy on those that were executing him.
mm,
So I think that's just one example, but characteristically, these were principled based presentations that
mm,
were given by the Christians, okay? Not always answered in the same spirit, but I think this is something that will help us here. As a follower of Christ and instructing other followers of Christ in my writing and my speaking, interviews like this, all I can do is appeal to them to be noble and sound in the way they engage,
mm,
noble in their manner, sound in their content. Make the case. Not everybody's going to follow. Not everyone's going to believe, even if it's a great case and you're really great in the way you do it. But that's not on your side of the ledger. Your side of the ledger is the way you is communicating the truth. The way I put it is as clearly, as truthfully, and as persuasively as possible. Now that doesn't mean we can't be clever. And the whole tactical approach, which we'll talk about in some detail here, is a way of being clever in conversations, but not in
mm,
an abusive way.
mm,
It's not loaded rhetoric. I guess you could say there are rhetorical elements that are involved here, but rhetoric at its best is making your case as persuasive as you can legitimately. At its worst, of course, it's distortionary. But
mm,
I think following the pattern there of the New Testament um, apostles and Christians and how they made their case, and then off on into the first century where things got a lot worse for them in the culture in general, is really helpful for us. One last thing is that one of the ways that the early Christians made their case, especially, pardon me, in the second century, was that they said, Look at the God we serve is actually a good God, and the message that we're communicating creates good people and
mm,
good citizens, and the kind of people that you want to have in your community, and just in terms of their behavior, and never mind their underlying theology if you don't agree with it. Excuse me, and I think that's a message that
mm,
that as Christians we can communicate. We can
mm.
be mindful to communicate more effectively than we've done. So
Yeah.
those are some
And
thoughts that I have on the current cultural conversation.
yeah, and I appreciate both the content and the approach in there because the content matters, to be able to present something that makes sense and is worth believing, but also then to be shaped by a life that is credible itself
Yeah,
and a care or concern with whom you're speaking. And that idea of not seeing someone across from you as your enemy, but as
yeah.
someone made in the image of God, deeply loved, that you want to help invite to see the
By
truth
the
that
way,
you've encountered in Jesus.
that's not, pardon me for interrupting, but that's not
No, it's
always an
okay.
easy task for anybody, it
No
takes
way.
I mean, you mentioned spreading more heat than light, and boy, that was a characteristic of me for many years.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
just had to pull. I've had to learn
Mm,
to be a better Christian, quite frankly, in the way I engage the ideas.
mm,
And so I get it. On either
mm,
side, it's hard
mm.
to, in a sense, maintain your cool, as we say here in the States.
Totally. Well, Greg, your latest book, Street Smarts, which has only come out in the last 12 months, actually picks up, I think, really helpfully in this area about how do we just have better conversations. And certainly it's written for Christians in that it particularly then supplies what are some of the meaningful questions or objections that may be raised for Christians as part of a bigger God conversation that you could respond to. But it's also just full of practical wisdom on how
Yeah.
to have better conversations in general that I think anyone would benefit from, no matter kind of what side of the religious, political, or moral aisle they find
No,
themselves.
that's a good
And
point.
and so on that. on that basis, I'd love to maybe frame most of this interview just around let's explore some of that. How do we have better conversations in general, but then
Sure.
also some of the key objections? And one
Right.
thing that really struck me opening up the book is that from the very beginning, this is a book trying to help Christians have better God conversations so that they can talk about what they believe and why it matters. But you mentioned that you don't find that naturally easy. That's not something that is exactly who you are. So can you walk us through that dynamic
Yes,
for
of
you
course.
about, a lot of people would say Christians are just trying to convert me. And you say, well, that's not exactly my goal and how I enter into these conversations. Walk us through that a bit.
Well, I struggled with my opening because it almost sounded like I'm starting too negative. But the very first line of the book is, I have a confession to make. Evangelism is hard for me.
Yeah.
Now, I wrote that because it's true, even though I do what I do, and I've spoken on more than 90 university and college campuses around the world, and excuse me, and done, you know, what I do. Yet, even so, it's a challenge. And
Mm,
my goal, I say that partly to put Christians at ease, because I think that's true for most people. It does not come naturally. All right, it's
mm,
it's a, it it's a controversial kind of issue, and controversial at the deepest level when we consider the kinds of things we talk about. But nevertheless, I do it. There's two aspects of this. I engage because I want to be a faithful follower of Christ. We have been given a commission by the man who faced the controversy himself in order to communicate the truth, and paid the ultimate price for it. Jesus of Nazareth,
mm,
executed on a cross for promulgating his convictions. Now we know there's a whole theological element that's to that. From a cultural perspective, that's the price that he paid, and so I do that out of an act of obedience, but also because it's I'm not just following the rules. There is a consequence to this. If you think about a doctor who has to work hard to learn his discipline, so to speak,
mm,
but then he has a fundamental concern about the health of his patients, and
mm,
so even if he's getting pushback from his patients, he's going to tell them what the truth is, because he said, "Look, this circumstance you're in is killing you,
mm,
and unless you deal with that, you're a goner," kind of thing. And that's
mm,
not always easy to do, just in that profession. So I'm speaking in a secular sense, but there's a similar dynamic here. And I think this is something that a lot of non-Christians don't appreciate. And it's partly because Christians haven't always been careful in their manner.
mm,
But there is nothing that a Christian has to gain personally to see someone else convert to Christianity, which simply means to adopt the ideas that the Christian is offering as actually true ideas about the world. And here's a distinction that needs to be made. I wrote a book once called The Story of Reality, and
mm,
it was really meant to capture the Christian worldview in a way that's accessible to people. But I asked the question there in the beginning, what is Christianity? And the simple answer, I think the proper answer, is Christianity is a picture of reality. Okay. It is not just a religion that you can choose if you like it, and if not, you choose another one, because these aren't social clubs. These are meant to be characterizations of the way the world really is.
mm,
Take gravity, for instance. If you stop believing in gravity, you're not going to float away, because gravity is a feature of the world. And this is exactly what Christianity, Jesus, and those that follow him have presented. This is the way the world actually is. And this has ramifications, long term, eternal ramifications. It doesn't go
mm,
away if you just don't believe in it. It's going to have an influence on you
mm,
long term, one way or another. And so, some people obviously don't like that, because there's a requirement to surrender autonomy to God, bend the knee, so to speak. But I would, if I could encourage your listeners who are not followers of Christ, maybe tire kicking or whatever, that deep down the Christian has the best of intentions in communicating these issues
mm,
to them, even if they're a little rough around the edges.
mm,
They care about your long term well being, and when I say long
mm,
term, I mean eternal, and that's as
mm.
long as it gets.
And I really echo that because I think back over the last 2 decades now, when I first became a Christian, and how much I used to stumble through conversations about God, because most of my schoolmates never really went to church or had any experience of belief in God or anything like
Right.
that. And they'd ask questions or throw out just fun insults as we do in Aussie culture to show affection. That's the way that we
Oh,
we
yeah.
tend to be
That's
sarcastically
a
paying
that
each other
actually
out.
is a guy thing, so I'm with that.
Yeah.
I get that part,
um, but I really struggle. Like, how do I respond to these things? I don't know what to say. I'm still figuring out exactly what the Christian worldview is in many respects, but I've encountered God. I've experienced God's love. I've been moved by his grace. I've been changed by that forgiveness. And so you've had this experience and you're trying to catch up and, all right, well, how do I talk about what that is and what that means? And sometimes you make some mistakes along the way. What are some of the mistakes that you think you see Christians commonly making in conversations about God that maybe has fostered those negative experiences that newcomers or skeptics often describe when they think about the Christians who have spoken to them in the past? What are some of those common trip ups that we should be
yeah.
wary of?
Well, there's a couple here. One might surprise you. A part of it is that Christians don't understand Christianity. A lot of Christians, in other words, people who self-identify, I guess is the proper way currently to characterize it. They self-identify as Christians, but they don't understand Christianity, and they end up saying a lot of things that
Yeah.
are not the view of Jesus or the world view that Jesus held. Okay, it's like kind of another issue, but I mean, you ask what's one of the biggest problems.
Yeah.
That's one. Another one is the way the language Christians use characteristically. All right, I have a tactic in the tactics book, which is
Mm.
a prequel, so to speak, to Street Smarts, which we're talking about, and it's called Watch Your Language. And I'm not talking about cursing, like I'm talking down to Christians for using bad words.
Yeah.
I'm kind of presuming they're being careful about that anyway, but I'm talking about the language that they use to describe spiritual verities, and the language is just too parochial. It's too much Christian. We talk about people being saved.
Mm.
We talk about people believe in Jesus as Savior and Lord, and on and on and on with all kinds of things that, frankly, especially nowadays, this wasn't true 50 years ago when I became a Christian, 50, almost 51 years now, in the Jesus movement in Southern California. But nowadays, this is religious noise to people. And so we have to find a different way of talking, which just simply means finding synonyms for our language. So I don't talk about being saved. I talk about being rescued, because this is a non-religious term, but really captures what we're talking about. I don't use the
Mm.
word faith either, because the word faith is too easy to relativize to the Christian. Oh, that's your faith. That's your leap of faith. That's your
Mm.
blind faith. No, I talk about my convictions,
Mm.
and I talk about my act of trust in Jesus. I don't talk about receiving Jesus as Savior and Lord. I talk
Mm.
about following Jesus.
Mm.
And of course, you got to know something about him to follow him. Now, of course, all of these are kind of synonyms in substance, but they're heard by others very differently. But
Mm.
probably the chief one, these are important facts, details of regarding what you asked. But the most important one is the excuse me, more bellicose posture that Christians take, and sometimes in response to non-Christian attacks by non-Christians, but they take a more bellicose posture in their warlike, posture in their engagement with others.
Mm.
They're you're the enemy. You're opposite me. You're bad. I'm good, or at least your ideas are bad, and my ideas are
Yeah.
good. And let me tell you why you're wrong. Okay. Now, of course, there's a certain sense that that's always true in discussions about different ideas, but it's the attitude or style that seems to come across that's really critical.
Mm.
And this is where the antidote, in my view, and this would be applicable to both sides of the discussion, but ironically, it's actually um, more appropriately used with those who differ from us as Christians. The antidote is to ask questions.
Mm.
All right. No, I've built an entire tactical approach on that in the book Tactics, a game plan for discussing your Christian convictions, and then followed up by Street Smarts,
Mm.
which in the subtitle says using questions to answer Christianity's toughest challenges. Now, it is fairly common for non-Christians to ask Christians questions about their view, largely to, in some way, directly or indirectly, demonstrate the inadequacy of Christianity, because your view creates this problem, which it doesn't seem reasonable to me, or you can't solve, or you can't answer for, or whatever.
So
And
things like,
so,
what about evil and suffering in the world, or hasn't
perfect
science made it
example.
difficult to believe this? And yeah.
Yes, exactly like that. So they're willing to ask questions, but we are not we are not very good at answering or at asking questions in return. And it
Mm,
turns out that skill is really valuable. Let's just take the challenge that was offered there about, hasn't science made religion more less believable, or something like that? A very common response, to which I would say, how?
mhm.
That's a simple question. I just say, how so?
So
Explain to
instead of
me how.
launching into an 8 or 10 minute answer into something like that, you just ask a
Yeah,
question
I'm
back.
not
What
going to
do you
start.
mean by that? Yeah.
I'm not going to start preaching at them. I'm not going to start trying to answer the whole thing, because there is a presumption in the question. And the presumption is science has inveighed against the principles of Christianity. And if
Mm.
I try to answer that, I've almost given the other person the affirmed the point of view that's inherent in the question,
Mm.
instead of saying, okay, well, exactly how do you think science has? Now, what you offered just a moment ago, you said, what do you mean by that? And of course, that is the stock question that I teach in both books for this particular step of the conversation. What do you mean
So
by
what you're
that?
saying is I passed this interview by having some familiarity with your
Yes,
approach.
nice job. You got a star for that one, Dan. But that is my response. How has it done that? Or how do you think it's done that? That's just my,
Yeah.
in a certain sense, localized variation of, what do you mean by that?
Mm. That's
Somebody
really
says,
helpful, Greg, because I
yeah,
think like that's a really common experience. Is Christians almost adopt then this burden of proof? Someone's raised a question. I now need to be able to draw from the vast things that I've heard in the past on this subject and blurt all of that out for the next 5 or 10 minutes. When in
yeah.
reality, if I asked the simple follow up question, "What do you mean by that?" A lot of people would have this mood that science and religion are at war, but they wouldn't really be able to put their finger on exactly how
That's
apparently
such a good point.
science is a problem for Christianity.
And there are two things here, Dan. And the one is, you might pontificate in response, because you've had some background and information, you might be able to respond to that. A lot
Mm.
of people haven't had it, and they
Yeah,
don't really know
exactly.
how to respond.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Christian is at a loss there. But secondly, um, many times when people raise objections like that one, or even the problem of evil, which you mentioned a moment ago, which we can go into more in detail if you want, but um, when they raise this question, they are not speaking from a position of, in a certain sense, personal scholarship. It isn't like
Mm.
they work this out for themselves and they see, well, I know this, that, and the other thing about science, and this is direct contradiction to the basic tenets of Christianity. That creates a problem. So how can you be a Christian and somebody who respects science at the same time? I've
Mm.
fleshed that challenge out a little bit more there, but all that preliminary stuff usually is not in place with the person who offers the charge. They are
Indeed.
repeating what they've heard other people say,
Yeah.
that there's this conflict. And they might imagine something about Darwinian evolution, or I don't know, something like that, but they don't have, most of the time, they simply do not have any
Mm.
details. Plus, it is a very, very broad charge. And so, just from a strategic perspective, I'm going to want to know how, before I can tactically respond to the details, I'm going to want to know the precise detail.
Mm.
And so, when I ask in response to the question, how exactly has science invade against, in particular, Christianity here? How's that happened? Um, from a tactical perspective, notice I've just put the ball back into the other person's court.
Mm.
Okay. And that
Totally.
gives me some breathing room. It doesn't mean I'm not willing to engage the question, but the question has a vagueness about it that
Mm.
needs more clarification for me to be able even to begin to address it. And by the way, I know all kinds of stuff related to that issue, but I'm not
Mm.
going to go in if I'm smart in the moment. I'm not going to go and tell everybody everything I know about it because it's not a clever way of approaching
Mm.
it. Instead, I'm going to say, no, exactly how has that happened? Now it's the ball's in the other court. I bought myself some thinking time, but I've also created a conversation.
Mm.
I've said, okay, let me know. I'm here to
Mm.
listen. Tell me more. Tell me more. Tell me more. And what it does is gives you an opportunity to have a more clear idea of what that person thinks is the nature of the conflict that he's talked about. But it also is meant to help that person have a more clear idea about
Of
what they
why?
think the
Yeah.
nature of the conflict is.
Yeah.
But if they can't do that, well, then you've got, I call this a Simon and Garfunkel moment. Simon and Garfunkel moment. Sorry for the 60s alert there. I didn't give you an alert, but uh, the great musicians in my younger era, who I loved tremendously at the time, I still do. In 1966, they wrote a song called The Sounds of Silence. I mean, you might even
Mm.
be familiar with it. I don't know.
Yeah.
But in any event, that's what you get when you say, well, how exactly is the conflict? Tell me what that is. You get the Sounds of Silence. You get
Mm.
Simon and Garfunkel because they're not aware of what it is. Now, what this is meant to do in an appropriate way, in a reasonable way, um, alert them to the fact that they don't really have an objection that's substantive
Mm.
unless they can give some depth to the challenge. Then it's not a substantive objection. This then turns out to be rather empty rhetoric. It's just noise
Mm.
at this point. But
And
it
that's
is
interesting because you kind of put a foot in the door that way, Greg, in the sense that if there's that way, a realization that, hey, maybe this, I don't know if there's something really behind this objection. What about all the other things that I've been told? If this objection turns out to just be a sense of a mood or a bit of rhetoric or people's individual perspective that doesn't actually match reality,
yeah.
is that true of many of the other objections or things that
Well,
I've heard?
it
So it's almost like a stone in the shoe that can just
it
open up
is.
a willingness to dive deeper.
And Dan, I'm glad you used that phrase. If I could just discursus here, because one of the points I make in both of the books, remember that the book Tactics is a more general book, and the Street Search is much more specific to one aspect of the tactical game plan, which is the third one, which is using questions in a very creative way,
Yeah.
as I teach in Street Smarts, to answer the challenges, okay, to make your point on your
Mm.
side. And I'm not trying to close the deal. I'm not trying with the person in front of me who's pushing back pretty hard with challenges or questions. And maybe they're not always pushing back hard. Maybe they're genuinely interested because they have an interest in Christianity, but this is
Mm.
a roadblock for them.
Yeah.
That's true sometimes too. But my goal is just to, as you put it, put a stone in their shoe. It's not
Mm.
to close the deal. It's not to cause them to give a commitment. My experience has been, and I've been doing this for 50 years now as a Christian, and I've been taking a poll ever since this book came out a year ago with all my audiences now. And the poll bears this up. Most people who become Christians do not become Christians because someone actively led them to Christ. Now, I'm using Christian language here. The
Mm.
Christians know what I'm talking about. In
Yeah.
other words, you work with somebody, then you challenge them to receive Christ as Lord and Savior. Here, sign on the dotted line. You close the deal, or maybe there's an altar call at a church or something. By the way, I'm not against any of those things. It
Mm.
turns out that's not the way most Christians become Christian. And even your listeners can ask themselves the question. You can't get a poll here, a show of hands with this group, but my experience is 75% on average, sometimes even closer to 100%, sometimes a little less. But 75 to 80% of all the Christian audiences I talk to uh, are individuals who became Christians not by somebody leading them to Christ. There's
Mm.
some other story involved, some other way they became. In fact, that was true in my own life. Even though my
Mm.
brother was the one doing most of the work, when he came to press further that at one night uh, at my apartment in 1973 in West LA about Jesus, I said, Mark, I already want to become a Christian. You have to tell me anymore. I'm ready. He actually says that what I said was, I already am a Christian.
Mm.
So he didn't harvest me. In a certain sense, I harvested myself, you know. Of course, we know that it was God working in a certain way to bring me to this conviction, but nevertheless, it wasn't this other way. And so this is where I make the distinction in my books
Mm.
between harvesting, reaping is the way Jesus talks about it in John chapter 4, and gardening or sowing, in
Mm.
Jesus' words. There's a difference between gardening and harvesting.
Mm.
And most of the work is done gardening. And if the
Mm.
gardening is done a little here, a little there, as you put it, putting a stone in someone's shoe, just giving them something to think about, then when the fruit is ripe, using that agricultural metaphor again,
Mm.
meaning when that individual is convinced, ready to, okay, I'm making a change here. All
Mm.
right. That happens almost automatically. The way I put it is when the fruit is ripe, you just bump it and it drops into the basket.
Mm.
Ripe fruit is not on the tree, it's laying on the ground.
Mm.
It falls. And you don't need to be twisting people's arms. You don't need to, in my view, it's controversial. People disagree. I get it.
Mm.
But I'm going to justify it in just a moment. What I'm saying is, you don't need to challenge people to receive Christ. You don't have to ask them to walk down the aisle. Nothing wrong with that. If pastors want to do that, it's up to them. But there are no altar calls in the Bible. In the book of Acts, which is the broad history of the early church, no altar calls, no altar calls in any gospels. And neither place is anybody challenged to receive Jesus as Lord and Savior. There's none of those more modern motifs of moving people to make a public decision for Christ. I
Mm.
guess the closest would be a baptism, and there were a lot of baptisms in the book of Acts. But notice the baptism were for people who had already made that move.
Mm.
All right, and even when the Philippian jailer asks Paul in Acts 16, "What must I do to be saved?" Paul just tells him. He says, "Believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, you and your whole family."
Mm.
And then the jailer responds. He doesn't say, "Do you want to receive Jesus Lord?" or nothing like that. Um,
Mm.
it's. I guess my point is uh, twofold. One is, if the gardening is done properly, then the harvest is going to come naturally. All right,
Mm.
and the second thing is, I have had so many people tell me, Dan, that this has absolutely transformed their approach, because when they are told that they have to challenge people to receive Christ, guess what? They don't do it. They don't
Mm.
do anything. They sit on the bench because that's too scary for them.
Yeah.
But when I tell them, if you just do a little here, a little there, and of course, both of these books teach how to garden effectively
Mm.
because there's a game plan that help you to do it. Um, then they're willing to get in and have these friendly conversations,
Mm.
just to get people thinking. And then God uses that to move that individual
Mm.
down the line,
Yeah.
and it gets more people off the bench and
Yeah.
in the game, so to speak.
And what I really appreciate about this asking questions is you're just asking people to try and consider what makes the most sense about reality. Like that big picture that you said
Yeah,
Christianity is a take on reality. It says
yeah,
that this is what we really think best describes the universe, us, and everything else.
right.
And so these questions, even if you're not a Christian and you're listening to this, you may think, oh, dude, this sounds really interesting, very intentional decisions trying to get people to believe in Christianity. It's trying to get people to see truth.
Yes,
What
you know,
Christians have
this is
become convinced is the true take on things, and so it's clear thinking with these questions. And in chapter 2, so I think 3 and 4 in Street Smarts is kind of where you spell out again what you call the Columbo tactic, but just these
yes,
string of questions that are useful for trying to get people to rethink where they are and whether that makes the
right.
most sense. You want to walk through? We already talked about that, but what do you mean by that? As sort of the first level one. But are there other sort of questions that are asked there? I mean, Jesus
That's
uses
right.
questions all the time in the Gospels to have better conversations, and you've picked up on that and have sought to apply that with some helpful models. So, what are some of those other questions that
Yeah,
you use?
Jesus used questions something like almost 300 times. They're all over, and he was using them purposefully. Okay, so what I've done is I picked up on that, and I'm capitalizing now on a very famous TV character, the number one TV icon, recognizable TV icon of all time, apparently, Peter Falk playing a character called Columbo, who is a murder detective. And what was fun about watching Columbo, I don't know if you had Columbo in Australia, but you guys get the imports, I imagine. So, although that was the TV era, and we moved past the standard.
We're educationally British and institutionally British, and we're entertainment-wise American. So that's kind of the two worlds that we draw
Well,
from.
that's interesting. Well, I guess in a certain sense, you're getting the best of both worlds. So we entertain, and the
Debatable.
Brits kind of educate. So we're kind of dunderheads on a lot of things, us Yanks. But what was interesting about Columbo, and people who have seen it, they understand the point. If not, when I give a presentation, I do a characterization with the trench coat and the cigar, the whole deal. That's kind of fun. But here's a guy who comes into a crime scene, and he doesn't look threatening, to put it simply. All right. He's got this cigar. He's got a pad of paper, but he can't use it because he doesn't have a pen or pencil. He's got to bum a pencil off of somebody, and he's scratching his head, mumbling to himself, and it's like this guy looks stupid.
And if you're a
Um,
suspect, you feel relatively safe because of
yes,
that.
of
Like, he's not
course.
going to figure me out. Yeah.
That's right. And by the way, in the way these episodes unfold, you always know who the murderer is, and he's always present in these presentations, the husband or the wife or the business associate, whatever, and they think they're completely untouchable. But he starts asking these questions, inconsequential questions, it seems, and they say, "Oh yeah, thank you. I'm sorry I keep asking. Yeah, Dad, you're very smart, And he does this stuff, and he's very disarming in his style. But eventually, the answers to the questions that he asks, these answers begin to add up to something. And now this is the way he gets the information he needs to get to solve the crime. And then his questions are much more pointed, though he still is doing the bumbling detective routine. So I chose him because it's a good picture of how to come in under the radar, as it were, graciously, and using questions to gather different types of information that give you a lay of the land, as it were, before you start using questions to pursue the end that the Columbo is after, and that is to identify the murderer, who now he has some understanding who it is, and he's trying to work him into a corner to basically burn his own bridges. And so the murderer, he doesn't have any place to go. And so the way I've developed that into a game plan is 3 steps. The first step is simply gather information. So I tell Christians, when you find yourself in a circumstance where maybe you'll have some spiritual impact, or you'd like to, or somebody's already challenging you, and so you're in a spiritual conversation, the first thing you want to do is not even answering the question, if that's what's happened. You want to gather information. It's the first step, gather information. And you're going to gather information with some form of the question, what do you mean by that? We already talked
Yeah.
about that. And it has all kinds of different variations. If somebody says, well, you shouldn't push your morality on me, maybe you're talking about an ethical point of view that you believe applies to everybody. You shouldn't be pushing your morality on me. Well, my question is, well, how exactly am I pushing or forcing my morality on you? Now, that's a what do you mean by that question, but it's germane to the specific issue. I've adapted it or adjusted it. When people say, well, science has shown religion is false. Oh, really? How exactly has science done that? Oh, I wasn't aware of that. I've heard this claim, but can you tell me exactly what you think science has taught that makes the things that I'm talking about unbelievable?
Yeah.
Now the ball is tossed back in their court, okay, and that's just another version, by the way, of what do you mean by that? And there's lots and lots and lots of examples of this, and in the books, I give examples in true life situations, some anecdotal and some just illustrations that I build to make the point. But I've had lots and lots of conversations with people like this, so the anecdotes are quite poignant, it seems to me. And incidentally, even this first step can be really powerful. I tell in Street Smarts, maybe you've gotten there already because it's the early chapters. It's talk about talking to a waitress in Seattle where it was really early Sunday morning. I've been working Friday night all day Saturday at events. Sunday morning I had to preach in a church, and I was like, oh, and I'm not a morning person, Dan. I don't know about you, but I'm just like inert. The way I say it is, before my first cup of coffee, I'm an atheist, right? So,
Yeah.
and here I am, and she's trying to engage me. Oh, dark 30. I'm just trying to get coffee on my way to the event. And it's at a hotel cafe, and but she starts talking about her own views. She said, well, I told her. She said, What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I didn't want to talk to her, of course, but I said, okay, I'm going to preach at a church." I figured that would get her to go. She said, "Oh, that's great." Now I'm mystified. Why is that great to her? Oh, she must be a Christian. Are you a Christian? No, I'm not a Christian. I used to be, but now the universe takes care of me, is what she said, which to me is borderline incoherent. And I don't mean to be condescending. I mean, I just don't think that makes much sense. So I asked her, "How does the universe take care of you? Is the universe a person?" She said, "No, the universe isn't a person." "Well, how does it take care of you?" And she paused and she thought, "Oh, okay, well, I guess God takes care of me." "Oh, well, that makes sense," I said. And then she said, "And God is the universe," which didn't make sense to me. So I asked her again, "How is God the universe?" And honestly, notice I am not interested in engaging her spiritually. Like I said, I'm just out of it. Leave me alone. That was my attitude. But I couldn't help because she's saying these things that made no sense to me. And so I'm just asking clarifying questions, which is the first step of Columbo. I guess you could say my inner Columbo was coming out even against my will there. Finally, she left, though. And I honestly thought to myself, there's nothing that I said that registered with her in any event, in any way at all. And again, all I did was ask some questions for clarification, which I didn't get to my satisfaction. But at the end of the meal, when she came to give me my check, she said this to me. She said, "Nobody's ever asked me questions about my view before." And it got me thinking. Well, that's what I'm after. Stone in her shoe. But the reason I mention this, and I put it in the first chapters of Street Smarts, is I want people to see the power of an approach like this, and how God can use it, even when I might say, even when I'm not trying, even when I was trying not to try. Okay, I didn't want to talk. All
You
right.
got forced into it.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
But this is just the first step, and I've seen this time and time again. And in fact, I have another anecdote from somebody who called my own radio show and said, "Very first time I tried the tactical approach, here's what happened." And I wrote that about that also down in Street Smarts in the beginning. And so the point I'm making is these things can be very powerful. Because of the nature of the thing. They're questions, they're genial, they're drawing other people out, and they're forcing other people to think more carefully about the things they actually say spiritually about spiritual things, because they don't usually think carefully about it. Okay. So there's the first step. The first step is gathering information with some form of the question. What do you mean by that? Now, the second step is also gathering a different kind of information. The first one, you want to try to figure out what they mean or what they think in a more precise fashion. The second question is you want to know why they think what they just told you they think, especially if it's some view or point of view or some point against Christianity. And
So
so,
asking questions like, why has that convinced you? Why? How did you come to believe that? What are your
yes,
sources? That sort of questions.
yeah, for example, somebody might say, well, the Bible's been changed. Very common statement. That has to do with the integrity of the process of copying over thousands of years. How
Yeah.
do you know that what we have today reflects the original that was written? And a very common objection that comes up. People have a lot of misconceptions about how that whole thing took place. But I'm going to ask, oh, the Bible's been changed. Well, what do you mean it's been changed? How do you think it's been changed? Now, that's the first question. What do you mean by that? Let them talk. So after they've said this, now here's the impulse of the Christian. The impulse of the Christian who has, especially if they have a little education, maybe read something about this, is to tell them why they're wrong. Well, the Bible hasn't been changed because it went through a careful process, blah, 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 blah. Notice how it is the objector that has made the claim, the Bible's been
Mm,
changed, and the Christian has taken it upon him or herself to demonstrate that they're mistaken. Okay. Now, what that is they've taken the burden of proof on themselves regarding this, or more specifically, the burden of disproof.
mm,
The rule is the rule of, critical thinking is that the person who makes the claim is the one who bears the burden of proof. So if
mm,
you say something is true and it's controversial, it's not the job of somebody else to refute you. It's your job, at least initially, to defend it and give the
mm.
reasons why. And
Yeah.
when the Christian takes that responsibility on themselves, then they've given their challenger a free ride. Okay. And this is the point of the second step of the game plan. Don't give them a free ride.
Mm.
Let them answer for their own view. So
Because
after
often the
you,
kind of justifications they may give is I heard it on a TikTok video or a popular science communicator who might
yes,
moonlight
well,
as a critic of Christianity, said it on an interview on a talk show radio or something like that.
that's right. So, well, all that is, I mean, in a certain sense, that's just hearsay at this point.
Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
not. It's not a substantive answer. So, my to this question, Bible's been changed. I ask, well, what do you mean? And then they might explain what they think because they heard other people say this is the way it happened. My second question, this is the second step. I'm reversing the burden of proof.
Mm,
I'm going to ask that person, why are you convinced it actually happened the way
mm.
you just described it happened?
Yeah.
Now, that's a different kind of question, and that's really vital. And some people at this point are going to be somewhat speechless, Simon and Garfunkel again, right? Because they don't even think that's a relevant point,
Mm,
that they should defend the claim they made as being actually an accurate claim.
yeah.
It turns out it's not an accurate claim. People will say, for example, very common on the internet now, well, the Bible was changed when at the Council of Trent, and a bunch of people, for political reasons, decided which books were going to be in the Bible.
Mm,
Well, that's actually two. They say the Bible was changed at the Council of Trent. Oh, what does that mean? Well, then they give this all these political people blah blah blah. I said, how do you? Okay, good. I think I understand your point now. Now, how do you know that happened at the Council of Trent? That's the second question. Now, I know that didn't happen at the Council of Trent. I know that we have the historical records of it. It had nothing to do with that. But nobody who makes a statement has any access to that information, because if they
mm.
did, they wouldn't have made the
They would
statement.
know.
It's
Yeah.
completely false. But it is one of those common, what do you call, like social or
Misconceptions. Yeah.
misconceptions. I was going to
Yeah.
say, I was going to use a stronger word like fantasy or
Cultural myths or something like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
so
That goes
cultural
around.
myth. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Urban
Yeah.
myth. That was what I was looking for. It is a
Yeah.
common urban myth among people. But notice how in these first two steps of the game plan, all we're doing is asking questions
Mm.
of a different
And the
kind to
benefit
get a
here, I
different.
think, Greg, is the sense that if Christianity is true, then reality is on your side. So
Yes,
by asking
excellent.
these sorts of questions, there shouldn't be a fear or concern associated with the responses. Most of the time, you're just trying to help people parse out their
Exactly.
thinking and recognize it may be a castle built in the clouds.
Yes, that's a perfect way of putting it. I've used the phrase before myself. Reality is on our side. If our
Mm,
view is true, and I think our view is true, in the strong sense of the word true, is I'm not saying it's true for me, and this is where Christians sometimes get in trouble by relativizing their own view. Well, this is my
mm,
belief. Okay, and I have a different belief, the guy says.
mm.
So we each have different beliefs. So what?
Yeah.
They don't talk as if Christianity is actually true.
Mm,
Okay, but I think it is, and so do you, and so do many others. And if it is true, that means it matches reality,
mm.
and therefore reality is on our side. And our appeals to reality then should be supportive of our convictions.
Absolutely. So, if we could maybe turn to applying these steps to just a couple of questions, because that's a
Sure.
big chunk of street smarts, which I really appreciated. Just seeing you actually walk out some of these conversations. And for people that aren't
Yeah.
familiar with the book, you just give a lot of examples of someone might raise this objection. Here's how it might be termed. Here's how I might respond asking some of these questions, digging a little bit deeper. So, we mentioned before the problem of evil, which is maybe one of the most common objections to Christianity.
Right.
Certainly, I would say maybe the strongest argument combined with divine hiddenness used to support a rejection of Christianity. This
Right.
idea that if God really loves us and is powerful enough to intervene, why do bad things happen in the world?
Right.
What would you say to someone who would raise this objection in a conversation over a cup of coffee? How might you apply this particular Columbo
A
approach?
a large cup of coffee. Cups of coffee, as it turns out.
Yeah.
Well, this is one of the classical objections to any kind of theism, especially Christian theism. I would, just as a point of information, I would put divine hiddenness in a different category because that is a concern people are. Why doesn't God show himself more obviously? But I actually think this is an example where God does show himself.
Mm,
And there are two aspects of this, okay? And one of them is that that there is a that there seems to be a contradiction in the notion of a good, powerful God and the existence of evil, because the thinking
mm,
goes, well, if God is good, then He'd want to get rid of all evil. And if this God is powerful, he'd be able to, but evil still exists. So either he's not good or he's not powerful, or really he doesn't exist at all.
mm,
Okay. Now there's two other aspects of this, and one aspect is the more complex one, which I do not deal with in Street Smarts, and the the job of theodicy, which is a word to describe a way of talking about the problem of evil, to explain why God would be justified in allowing evil in the world. And frankly, there's a
mm,
lot of different directions to go on that. Okay.
mm.
Um, the book that I mentioned earlier, The Story of Reality, I spent some time talking about that, but these
Sure.
are conjecture. Okay. But it's meant to show that there are possible explanations. But the simple possible explanation is that the equation, if God were good and if he were powerful, then there wouldn't be any evil in the world. That statement, it's just simply false. And because the rejoinder is, and this is the background to how I deal with it in a conversation. The back the fact is that it's not the case that if God were good, he'd want to get rid of all evil in the world. He would only get rid of all evil in the world unless he had a good reason to allow evil, at least for a season. In principle, he might have had a good reason to allow it. Okay.
Mm,
And virtually every philosopher nowadays, the has abandoned this argument, at least as just stated. It was called the deductive problem, because they
mm.
realized, well, it's possible that God could have had a reason. And this is what theodicy says. Here's the reasons that he might have had. Okay, but in Street Smarts, I deal with a different problem. I approach it in a different way. Okay.
Which may be
Um,
beneficial because I think there's a lot of people that might not know the range of theodicies that they could draw
yes, of
from. So they
course.
haven't got that philosophical or theological training to say,
Right.
well, here's 11 different explanations that Christian thinkers have offered over the centuries. So they might be sitting there saying, that's a really good question. And what I like
Yeah.
about Street Smarts is you give them another way of kind of responding
Yes,
to that without
exactly.
having to
So
know too much.
this is a simpler way, and indirectly it does deal with the hiddenness of God. And The way I deal with Street Smarts is I take each of these issues and then present the concern, and then I explain, here is the liability.
Mm,
Here's why this doesn't work. Whether it's atheistic objections, the problem of evil, whether it's Bible and science, whether it's sexual issues like gender, sex, and marriage, whether it's issues about Jesus or issues about the Bible,
mm,
there's a whole host of them that I cover. And then first I say, here's why it's not going to work. Okay. But now you got to know, how do you take that information that I've just offered you and then employ it in a conversation where you're using questions to make your point? Okay. Because that's the shrewd way. Jesus
yeah,
said, be
totally.
but innocent as doves, but shrewd as serpents, right? So that's the shrewd way. So here's the key to this one. The
Mm,
key is, in the problem of evil, is the problem of evil is not a Christian problem. It's not a theist problem. It is a human problem. That is, it doesn't matter where you live or when you lived. Everybody knows something is wrong with the world. Okay. So that means any philosophy that you engage in, whatever religion, you engage in, whatever non-religious philosophy that you think is true about the world, you are still confronted with the problem of evil. It is one of
Mm.
the most salient features of reality. So your worldview, if it's meant to explain reality, has got to help us understand that detail in a way that seems to comport with our common
Yeah.
intuitions about reality, right? All right. So it turns out that the atheist can't do this. The Christian can do this, the Christian theist, because to put it simply, evil is part of our story.
Mm.
It starts in chapter 3 and it doesn't get resolved until 66 books later. The whole story is about the problem of evil. So there's a coherence here, that this belongs in our story. We
Mm.
have an explanation for where it came from, and we have an explanation for how it gets resolved.
So that
Okay.
kind of protest that raises this question, there's something wrong with the world, is a protest that the Christian story kind of validates.
Of course. Yes, of course, something's wrong with the world.
Yeah.
So we don't have to run from this. All right. So, first of all, it's coherent in our story because we have objective good and evil. We have human beings who are violating the good and creating the evil. So,
Mm.
of course, people are going to raise the question, why did God allow that?
Yeah.
Okay. And this is where the rest of the story is meant to tell that, at least in some measure. However, in an atheistic worldview, it's not coherent because you have to have a way the world is supposed to be before you can say the world is not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Problem of evil. But in atheism, there is no way the world's supposed to be.
Mm.
It is just molecules in motion. That's
Mm.
it. Okay. There is no foundation. There is no basis for genuine morality. Now, some
Mm.
people will punt to or try to invoke Darwinian evolution here, but to be fair, all Darwinian evolution can explain, if it can explain morality at all, is a relativistic subject of morality. And I do go into detail in Street Smarts on this. And the objection isn't that you have a moral view that's different from mine. Why would God ever allow you to have a moral view that's different than
Yeah.
mine? That's relativism. The objection is there's real evil in the world that's
Mm.
objective. But there is no foundation for such a thing
Mm.
in atheism, and
Mm.
of course, Darwinian evolution doesn't provide
Mm.
objective standards for morality. Biology can't make anything wrong. It
Mm.
can maybe make us think something's wrong to help us get our genes into the next generation, but it can't make anything wrong.
Mm.
Our awareness is that things are actually wrong. So, what best explains that? Okay,
Yeah.
so now you see the problem. Okay, the way that I would employ this in a very simple dialogue with someone is they raise the question. The atheists raise the question. Oh, if there is a God, then there's so much bad in the world. How could a good God who's really powerful um, account for such a thing? You Christians have an unsolvable problem, and so. And maybe they'll elucidate with some details about, rape and murder and genocide and on and on with these obvious evils in the world. Okay, fine. So, just for clarification, now what I'm going into role play mode
Yeah.
here. I'll play both
Yeah.
sides for the sake of our discussion. What you're saying is there's all this evil in the world, and in your mind, that disqualifies the existence of God. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Okay,
Mm.
let's say you're right. And by the way, I'm sympathetic to that. I
Mm.
I can understand entirely. I would say that to them because I am sympathetic.
Mm.
Um, let's just say you're right. There is no God. Do the things that you just described, do they still happen? I mean, the rape and the murder and the pillaging and the genocide and all that. Of course, it happens.
Mm.
Well, is it still evil? Yes, of course it's evil. That's why I don't believe in God. Okay, now I'm confused at this point. Maybe
Mm.
you can help me out. Can you explain to me how rape and murder and pillaging and all those other things you described are actually evil in a materialistic universe devoid of God, in which all we have is molecules in motion?
Mm.
Can you help me out there? Okay, now notice that question is very different from the first two. I'm
Yeah.
not asking for information about their view or the reason for their view. I am asking them a question about a flaw in their view. Okay. Now, I don't think that question is answerable. And it's what it's meant to show, and I'd articulate this more in friendly conversation, is
Mm,
that I don't have this problem. Follower of Christ, I'm a Christian. I acknowledge the reality of evil. It makes sense in my world because there are laws that God has set up that people break. They're
mm,
not supposed to, but they do it. Okay. Now, why he might allow them to do it, that's another issue.
mm,
Okay, that's theodicy. That's another issue, and maybe I'll talk to him a little bit about that. But the first thing I want you to see is this is not a conflict in my worldview.
mm,
All right. But in your worldview, you can't make any sense of this whatsoever.
mm,
Okay. In fact, what you are forced to do is you are forced, and this is where some will go candidly, you are forced to deny the existence of objective morality entirely and
mm,
therefore deny the problem of evil.
mm. I think
Okay.
that would definitely be true at a street level, which is what I appreciate about the book. There would be sophisticated listeners who would be thinking, "Wait a second, the problem of evil is an internal critique of Christianity. If apparently God is real, these things would be evil, and they're incompatible with God's attributes of
Right.
omniscience and omnipotence." But I think at the base level, I really appreciate this because if you're raising it as an internal critique, you still need to explain the evilness of evil and the wrongness of suffering. And in a world without God, it's really hard to do. It seems to be entirely undermined. So that to
Right.
make the problem of evil, you have to be willing to let go of the thought that these things really are evil and that
Yes.
suffering really is wrong. So you lose the right to protest.
Yes,
And
that's
so I really,
very
really
good.
appreciate that just being drawn
Well,
out. Are you willing to swallow that big elephant in
bite
order to make
yes,
the
bite
critique?
that bullet.
Yeah.
But I know you have a non-Christian audience and listener, so I want to speak to that just a little bit because
Mm,
you're right. There is a certain kind of philosophic end around where the person who is the atheist makes no commitments about evil in the world, and he
yeah.
just focuses in on the apparent internal contradiction. First of all, and I've had pushback by some people on that point.
Yeah.
And my first response is I have almost never heard that on the street from
Yeah.
anybody, even what people who thought they were more sophisticated
Yeah.
atheists. They say, "How can there be so much evil in the world?" Is what they say. They don't clarify. Well, this is an apparent internal contradiction in your
Mm,
worldview. They acknowledge the reality of evil. Secondly, I would ask them if they press this. I would say, "Are you saying there's no evil in the world?
mm,
Are you saying you are unwilling to commit to the affirmation that evil, wicked things happen in the world?
mm.
Really?"
And it's
And
hard
this
to
is,
do because these are such deep intuitions that you effectively
of
have to say, all
course,
right, my interpretation of reality makes me deny something that feels so deeply true about the way that the world is. And it
uh,
almost, I think, at that point sets the mind and the heart at war, which again,
yes,
that dissonance might be a little bit of a wake up moment for people.
it's an incredible dissonance that is created there. But notice how even I'm not answering their challenge yet. I have a way of answering, but I
Yeah.
just want to say, okay, well, if I understand you right, you are saying this because you are not making any commitment to the existence of evil in the world,
Mm,
which would be consistent with materialistic atheism.
yeah.
But is that really your view? Okay, then what makes you think that that view is actually true when the
Mm,
world seems so filled with evil? As one
mm,
person put it, if and suffering, and morally inappropriate suffering is the
mm,
point. One person put it this way: if I think he said, if suffering were water, the world would drown.
mm,
Very powerful, I think, statement. So what I'm trying to help the other person see, even though I'm not answering the issue that they pressed at the moment,
mm,
is that the alternate is not acceptable.
mm,
The alternate is completely
yeah.
unacceptable. Everybody knows, that something's wrong with the world.
Mm.
So,
In that
but then
sense,
I
they're
can
more biblical than they realize. Because
pardon
your
me?
sense of protest, in that sense, they're more biblical than they realize
Yes,
because
that's
their
right.
protests or their feelings about the world fit the Christian story in a much healthier way than it
Yeah,
does a
yeah.
world without
There's
God.
there's more than one thing like that in
Yeah.
in the human in the human self. There's
Mm,
a tactic I call inside out, and that just trades on these notions that things are built inside people because a human being's made in the image of God. They got to live in the world that God made, and
yeah.
consequently, you're not going to be able to avoid some of these truths that seem to be entirely at home in a Christian understanding of reality, but
Mm,
completely contrary to a materialistic atheistic worldview. So there's just we obviously we talk more and more about these things. The way I'd press the other alleged contradiction is I'd say there is no contradiction,
mm,
and because couldn't it be? All I have to do is ask the question: couldn't it be possible that God has a good reason for allowing
mm.
evil for a season? As
Yeah.
long as it's possible, and certainly it's possible, then the inherent contradiction just evaporates.
Mm,
And then theodicy gives a number of options about
mm,
why he might do that, and
mm,
they all have merit. But as long as it's just possible, then there's no inherent contradiction.
mm. And for those who may say, well, surely the scale of suffering and the horrendous nature of suffering makes God's existence improbable. I just want to flag we've actually got two Oxford philosophers coming on for a live stream next week where we're
Right.
looking at what is the full range of the theodicies or explanations
Sure.
available that might account for those. So just for anyone listening, tune back in a week and there'll be a lot more to come on that. But Greg, that's
Yeah,
such a,
let me
I just
say
think that,
something about that,
yeah, great.
if I could, if we have time. I do talk about this in the story of reality. This is now called the inductive problem.
Mm,
The deductive problem isn't going to work, but the magnitude of suffering.
yeah, the
Notice that,
evidential.
for one, even to raise the so-called inductive problem, the magnitude of suffering cannot be justified. Okay, that still trades on a moral quality. You have to make a moral commitment to the immorality of the suffering in order for that to be cogent. But this is an appeal that an atheist is not allowed to make because, on their worldview, they cannot ground morality. So they run into the same problem even with the inductive challenge.
Mm,
Okay. By what, in virtue of what, do you say that this magnitude of suffering is immoral?
mm,
On the atheistic view, it's not. It just isn't.
mm,
It's just molecules in motion, right? The materialistic view, and the Darwinian project allegedly is going forward, and the strong rule the weak, and that's just the way of nature, red in tooth and claw. How did Hobbes put it? Life in an unregulated state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish,
mm,
and short. But that's what atheism
mm,
gives you. Okay. So where's the grounds for the complaint? You can only complain and raise the issue from within some kind of theistic worldview.
mm.
Okay. But there are other difficulties with the inductive problem, but I did want to mention just
Yeah,
that
that's
particular
helpful.
point
Yeah,
because
yeah.
both complaints, deductive or inductive, have to acknowledge the reality of moral evil,
Mm. And if you're
which
going to
the
jump within the theistic framework to critique the theistic framework, that means theists have the right to draw from the resources of that story to try and offer meaningful answers. And I
this
think
is
that's the
exactly
benefit
right.
of the Christian story. It does give us some meaningful answers as
That's
to
right.
what may be going on in the bigger picture and what some of God's purposes or reasons might be for allowing bad things to happen. And so I really appreciate that. And I
Yeah.
just I wanted to say thank you just for being able to spell out a couple of examples of the way that when it comes to these conversations about science, suffering, and these are a few of a number of cases that you walk through in Scripture, in the book, sorry, that you raise these just helpful questions, clarifying, getting information, then looking
Yeah.
for where are these flaws or critiques that
Yeah.
might just say, hey, I'm not sure this makes as much sense as you think it does, given
Right,
your
right.
sort of footing or starting points. And
Thank
that's maybe just a helpful beginning for what is, like we said, not a conversation that end with them putting their hope in Jesus, but
you.
certainly is helping to say, well, maybe there's more to the intellectual
Yes,
comprehensiveness and the evidence that may even point towards Christianity. Maybe Christianity does offer a lens that is more full in its ability to explain the world.
yeah.
If
Well,
if
that
there
that sounds
were,
like
sorry, you go.
that's what I call gardening, Dan, and
Mm.
it sounds like you're winding down a little bit, and I thought, "Wait a minute, is it that late? Have we gone an hour already together?" But I guess we already have, huh?
Yeah, time
It's
flies
been
when you're in
wonderful.
great conversations. That's what I find with my friends as well. You're all of a sudden, Oh, it's the end of the night. We have to get going, get to work tomorrow. But I just want to say thanks so much for your time and being on here. Greg, obviously you're the president of Stand to Reason, and people can
That's
find
right.
str.org is the website and
That's
base.
right.
Some good friends of mine. So Tim Barnett from Red Pen Logic
Oh
has been on the
yeah.
channel here before and
Right.
been doing stuff together. So it's just great to be able to have you on. Just thankful for the work that you do. If there was someone who's watching this who's not a Christian but is exploring or curious or maybe still doubting and skeptical, what would be a parting message that you might want to leave with them?
Well, I think of something my younger brother told me when back in the 70s when I was pondering these issues, and he was the Christian, and he told me, he said, "Greg, the things that I'm telling you are true. Sooner or later, you're going to find this out.
Mm,
I just hope that when you do, it's not too late."
mm,
And the harsh reality, and this Jesus was very clear on, and so were all of those who Jesus trained to follow after him, is that there is going to be a day of reckoning. And we're going to stand before Jesus himself, and the books will be open and our lives will be laid bare. And we all know, if we're honest, that includes me, that will not be a pretty picture.
mm,
And this is where we need the rescuer, because the simple calculus is either Jesus pays, and I know you've explained the concept in your own show in the
mm,
past, either Jesus pays or we pay. Either Jesus pays or we pay.
mm,
And that's the simple calculus. And so it's never too late and it's never too early to bend the knee and beat your breast and say, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner.
mm. I so appreciate that. That's what we would say in the middle of it is the invitation of the gospel is to come
Yeah.
to have a relationship with God through his son Jesus. And if you're interested in, maybe this is the first video you've ever clicked on, we have a short video, What is Christianity, that in 4 minutes spells out the big story of the Bible, the Christian story, and what it means for you and how it answers life's deepest questions. Greg, thanks so much for coming on. If people want to follow you, we'll make sure we put all the links down in the show notes,
Thank
but it's
you.
been a
Thank
privilege to
you.
have you as part of the show.
Well, Dan, I had great fun. I really did. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks, mate. And thanks so much for joining for this episode of Questioning Christianity. You've made it right to the end. If you've got any desire to connect further, we've got a bunch of video content that wrestles with most of the biggest questions you could possibly ask about God, Jesus, the Bible, and everything else. Over on social media, at Instagram and Facebook, we spell out our videos with infographics and slides. Make sure you go and follow us there or on TikTok. And if you've got any questions, send them in through our website at questioningchristianity.com. But until next time, as we always say, truth invites questioning, and that truth really is worth believing. So we'll see you later.